The tablet designated K3375 in the British Museum's collection sits behind glass in room 55 of the museum's Mesopotamian galleries. It measures roughly 15 centimetres across. It was pressed and inscribed sometime in the 7th century BC, almost certainly in the city of Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, a king who collected written knowledge the way other kings collected tribute. It is the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and on its surface, pressed into the clay with a reed stylus by a scribe whose name we will never know, is a passage that has shaped almost everything the modern world believes about the Anunnaki and what they did during the flood. The passage reads, in translation, "The gods were frightened by the flood and retreated, ascending to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouching by the outer wall." What the texts most widely cited to describe that moment do not contain is what the older account recorded without flinching, that these same figures sat through the flood in hunger and thirst, weeping, pressing together like flies above a sacrifice, crying out at the destruction they had themselves decreed. Those two descriptions are not compatible. They are not variations on the same scene. One renders the Anunnaki as cosmic powers temporarily inconvenienced, retreating with dignity to higher ground. The other renders them as beings capable of suffering, regret, physical deprivation, beings who felt at some cellular level what they had done. Someone changed the record. The change was deliberate, documented, and traceable, and it is only one of several alterations across 5 distinct textual traditions that, taken together, produce a picture the popular understanding of the Anunnaki has almost entirely missed. This investigation begins with a question that sounds simple and turns out not to be: what did the Sumerian texts actually record about how the Anunnaki's presence on Earth ended, and what happened to that record afterward? Before the question can be answered, a preliminary observation is necessary. The Anunnaki do not appear in ancient texts as a fixed, stable, consistently defined group. That matters enormously. In the earliest Sumerian inscriptions from the period of Gudir of Lagash and the 3rd dynasty of Ur, roughly 2144 to 2004 BC, the word Anunna refers to the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon, the descendants of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. In those texts, they are earth presences. They take up their dwellings among the people of Sumer, as the composition known as Enki and the World Order puts it. They decree the fates of humanity from positions of active engagement. They are, in the most literal sense, here by the old Babylonian period, roughly 1830 to 1531 BC. The word Anunnaki in Akkadian texts means something different. It refers increasingly to the gods of the underworld. By the Middle Babylonian period, the shift is complete. Anunnaki designates underworld deities, while a separate category, the Igigi, designates the heavenly ones. The same word, spanning perhaps 400 years, describes a group that has moved from active earth presence to judicial sedentary permanence in the realm of the dead. That is the first thing no single popular account has successfully explained, not where the Anunnaki went. How the record of their going was altered, absorbed, redirected, and in some places quietly erased across texts separated by centuries and scribal traditions, in cities from Nippur to Nineveh, in languages from Sumerian to Akkadian, and what the oldest surviving accounts, the ones that predate the editorial revisions, actually said. Somewhere around the middle of this investigation, not yet, but in the distance there is a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, catalogue number CBS 0673, that contains a lacuna, a missing section, approximately 34 lines of text, gone. The lacuna falls at precisely the moment when the gods convene after the flood to decide what comes next. That missing section is the investigation's deepest problem, and it will stay missing. But what surrounds the gap is readable, and what surrounds it, read alongside the texts that later scribes chose not to reproduce in full, begins to constitute something like an answer. The name that changed the instability begins with the word itself. In Sumerian, the term is Anunna, written in cuneiform as a sequence of wedge marks that transliterate as Danuna or Danuna, with the divine determinative preceding the name to signal its sacred status. The standard scholarly reading, established by Jeremy Black and Anthony Green in their 1992 reference work Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, renders the term as princely offspring or royal offspring, the children of An, the sky. Britannica's entry on the subject, drawing on the same philological tradition, notes that the precise meaning remains ill-defined. That admission from a reference source is more significant than it initially appears. For a pantheon as extensively documented as the Mesopotamian one, a tradition that produced thousands of god lists, hymns, and administrative inventories in which divine names were recorded with bureaucratic precision, the core identity of its most significant group of deities remaining ill-defined, is not a failure of scholarship. It is a fact about the textual tradition itself. The Anunnaki resist clean definition because the textual tradition never settled on one. The earliest texts in which the term appears date to the reign of Gudir of Lagash, around 2144 to 2124 BCE, and to the third dynasty of Ur immediately following. In these texts, the Anunna are described in ways that emphasize their heavenly origin and their earth engagement simultaneously. The composition Enki and the World Order, preserved in multiple tablet copies and catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford under reference 1.1.3, has Enki declaring himself the big brother of the gods, and the Anunna responding by singing his praises and taking up their dwellings among the Sumerian population. The same text states twice that the Anunna decree the fates of mankind, an active, present tense, ongoing function. They are not absent authorities issuing instructions from a distance. They are resident. This is the Anunna of Ur III, powerful, present, engaged with the world, exercising something that functions like governance. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose decades of work with the Nippur tablet collections at the University Museum of Philadelphia remain foundational to the field, described the Sumerian conception of the divine as one in which the gods had direct, practical relationships with specific cities and their populations. Every major Anunna deity was the patron of a specific city and was understood to physically reside within that city's temple. Kramer's 1963 study, The Sumerians, is careful to note, as he was throughout his career, that the relevant tablets are often fragmentary and that reconstructions depend on careful editorial work across multiple damaged sources, but the pattern he identified is consistent. These deities were local presences with specific addresses. Something changed. The change is not sudden, and it does not announce itself as a change. It accumulates across the textual record between roughly 1800 and 1500 BCE. The critical transitional text is the Akkadian Atra Hassis epic, whose most complete surviving copy was made around 1650 BCE and published in the modern era by Wilfred G. Lambert and Alan Millard in 1965. Building on their landmark 1969 edition, Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood. In the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki appear in a structural role unlike anything in the older Sumerian texts. They are the senior gods, served by a lower class of divine labourers called the Agigi, when the Agigi rebel against their corv duties after 40 years of digging canals. It is the Anunnaki described as sitting in their divine assembly who must respond. The word Anunnaki in the Atrahasis still carries its sense of seniority and authority, but the tone has shifted. These are administrators. They hold councils. They weigh options. They are beginning, just perceptibly, to resemble a bureaucracy rather than a resident divine presence. The transformation becomes decisive in the texts of what scholars call the Old Babylonian and Middle Babylonian periods, roughly 1830 to 1155 BCE. In the Akkadian version of Inanna's Descent into the Netherworld, a translation and adaptation of the older Sumerian composition Ereshkigal, Queen of the Underworld, speaks of drinking water with the Anunnaki. She orders her servant Namtar to fetch the Anunnaki from their hall and seat them on golden thrones. Here, unambiguously, the Anunnaki are underworld residents. They are not visiting. They are not descending temporarily from heaven. They live there, seated, waiting to be summoned to specific duties. Their court is below the earth, not on it. By the Middle Babylonian period, black and green document, the terminological split is formalized. Anunnaki means underworld deities, Igigi means heavenly ones. What had been a single term for the most powerful gods in the Sumerian pantheon present on earth, active in its governance, has been divided, redeployed, and in one of its halves sent permanently underground. Thorkild Jacobson, whose 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, remains the most sustained scholarly examination of how Mesopotamian religious thought evolved across its own internal history, argued that this kind of terminological migration was not unusual. Religious traditions, he observed, absorb and reassign older categories as their theological concerns shift. What was once a name for active, engaged divine power becomes, in a later period, a name for a specific judicial function in the afterlife. The word persists. The meaning has moved. But Jacobson's framework raises a question he did not fully resolve when the Anunnaki migrated terminologically from earth presence to underworld judiciary. Was that migration accompanied by any record of how the transition was understood at the time? Did the scribes who were making this theological adjustment leave any trace of awareness that something had changed? The answer is not in any single tablet. It is distributed across several, in forms that are not always legible as records of transition, unless they are read against each other. And the oldest of those records, the foundation layer of the whole investigation, is not about the flood, or the underworld, or the administrative structures of divine governance. It is about a cosmological event so primary that later traditions took it entirely for granted the moment at the beginning of Sumerian theological time when heaven and earth were separated. It is with that original departure that the investigation must properly begin. Before the split, the first departure, the Sumerians believed that heaven and earth were once a single thing. The theological term for this undifferentiated original state is Anki Sky Earth, unified, inseparable, the primordial condition before any divine or human distinction, had been established. What the texts do record in fragments of cosmological hymns, in the opening sequences of creation narratives, in isolated lines embedded in longer ritual compositions, is the moment the unity ended. Enlil was born, and Enlil split heaven from earth. The cosmological accounts of this event are dispersed across the textual tradition rather than concentrated in a single text, which is itself significant. The separation of An and Ki appears to have been so foundational, so thoroughly assumed as background, that Sumerian scribes rarely felt the need to narrate it as a discrete story. It surfaces instead as a reference, a prior fact that later compositions invoke without explaining. In the Sumerian hymn to Enlil, catalogued in the Etziesel collection, lines establish that Enlil, whose command is far-reaching, whose word is holy, the Lord whose pronouncement is unchangeable, had, at the beginning of things, separated the above from the below, An, the sky god, taking the heavens, while Enlil himself took the earth. Kramer's analysis in the Sumerians identifies this account as representing the primary Sumerian cosmogony. The creation of the world was not an act of manufacture, but an act of separation, and its agent was the eldest of the Anunnaki. What is theologically striking about this account, and what later traditions would systematically obscure, is its implication for the nature of the Anunnaki's relationship to Earth. If Enlil separated heaven from earth and took the earth as his domain, then the Anunnaki's original status was not as beings who descended to earth from somewhere else. Their originary condition was earth present. The separation created the possibility of a heaven to which they might later withdraw. Before the split, there was no above to ascend to, and no below to which they might be confined. The cosmological event that is usually read as establishing cosmic order was also simultaneously the event that created the possibility of divine departure in the first place. This reading, and it is a reading, the texts are too fragmentary and too inconsistently copied to support certainty, receives indirect corroboration from the way later Babylonian texts handle the same cosmological moment. In the Babylonian Enmerili, the seven-tablet creation epic, whose standard version dates to the first millennium BCE, the equivalent moment Marduk dividing the body of the primordial sea dragon Tiamat to create heaven and earth is framed as an act of conquest and construction. Heaven and earth are manufactured from a defeated enemy. There is no prior unity to be separated. The Enma Eli removes the theological implication of the Sumerian account that an original undifferentiated wholeness once existed, that the Anunnaki were part of it, and that every subsequent act of divine movement, ascent, descent, withdrawal, departure, is a consequence of the primordial breaking apart. The Babylonian theologians did not falsify the cosmological record. They replaced it with a cosmology that did not carry the older account's implications. That distinction replacement, rather than falsification, will matter throughout this investigation, because the changes made to Anunnaki-related texts across the centuries are almost never straightforward deletions. They are substitutions. Something fills the space where the older account had been. The substitution is plausible on its own terms. It is only when read against the older account that the replacement becomes visible. The University of Chicago's Oriental Institute holds a collection of Sumerian hymns related to Enlil that have been partially transliterated and translated, and among these in passages that Jacobson cited in his 1976 study there are formulations that describe Enlil's original earth taking as the condition that made subsequent divine governance possible. Enlil is the Earth Lord because the earth became his domain at the separation. The Anunnaki are earth powers because they are his children, born into a domain he holds. Their later withdrawal from that domain, whether through the mechanism of the flood narrative, the city lament tradition, or the underworld transfer, is, in this light, a reversal of their originary condition. They are leaving the thing they were born into. No text states this directly. The theological implication has to be assembled from pieces. The fact that it has to be assembled rather than simply read is itself one of the things this investigation is about. The Flood and the Cowering Gods in 1982, Jeffrey H. Tigay of the University of Pennsylvania published The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic, a study that did something no popular account of the Anunnaki has adequately absorbed in the decades since. Tigay went through the flood narrative as it appears in the Atrahasis epic and as it appears in Tablet C of the standard Gilgamesh epic, and he documented line by documented line the changes made between the two. The comparison is not approximate. Both texts describe the same flood. Both feature the same divine decision-making structure, the same hero, the same boat, the same birds sent out to find dry land. They share enough verbal material that the relationship between them is not one of independent parallel tradition. The Gilgamesh Tablet C version was edited from the Atrahasis account, or from a version closely related to it, by the scribal tradition associated with Snelki Uninni, a Babylonian scholar-scribe traditionally dated to the period between 1300 and 1000 BC. Though some Assyriologists treat the attribution as conventional rather than biographical. What Tigay documented is what the editor changed, and why the changes matter. The Atrahasis account contains a passage that Lambert and Millard's translation renders as, the Anunnaki were sitting in thirst and hunger. During the flood itself, the senior gods sitting in their divine assembly experienced physical deprivation. They were not elevated above the catastrophe, they were caught in it, suffering alongside the creation they had decided to destroy. The same passage, in related lines, describes the gods pressing together like flies above a sacrifice when the flood survivors' offerings were made after the waters receded. Ishtar wailed like a woman in childbirth. The grief was physical, embodied, unguarded. The Gilgamesh Tablet C version rendered the equivalent moment as the gods feared the deluge. The Anunnaki became, in Jeffrey Tigay's precise language, recipients of an editorial weakening of the anthropomorphic descriptions of the gods. The specific detail hunger, thirst, physical suffering was replaced with a generalized emotional state. What was concrete became abstract. What was embodied became theological. Tigay identifies at least 3 categories of deliberate change in the Gilgamesh Standard Version's flood account. First, the omission of individual lines between preserved lines, not a wholesale deletion, but a surgical removal of specific content while leaving the surrounding material intact. Second, editorial changes to existing lines, the dragonfly's simile of Atrahasis, describing the flood victims, became the spawn of fishes in Gilgamesh, a change that removes the immediate. Terrestrial vividness of the earlier image. Third, the systematic weakening of the Anunnaki's anthropomorphic qualities, their hunger, their thirst, their weeping. The direction of these changes is consistent. Every alteration moves the Anunnaki further from embodied earth presence and closer to the detached, elevated, cosmic judicial role that characterizes their later Babylonian identity. The editor did not invent a new theology. The editor prepared the textual ground for one that was already developing. K1000-3375 in the British Museum, the tablet that became the primary vehicle for the modern world's understanding of the Mesopotamian flood, is, in this light, not the original record. It is the revised record. It is what the tradition chose to keep when it decided to let the older description go. The older description survives because Lambert and Millard's 1969 work recovered and translated the Atrahasis tablets held in the British Museum's collection with sufficient completeness to reconstruct the pre-revision account. The survival is somewhat accidental. The Atrahasis tablets were not unknown before 1965, but their relationship to the Gilgamesh tradition had not been systematically analysed at the textual level. Once Tighe performed that analysis in 1982, the editorial Archaeology became available to anyone who read the scholarship. The popular discourse around the Anunnaki has largely not read it. Two things emerge from Tighe's documentation that the investigation needs to carry forward. The first is the direction of the change, always away from vulnerability, always toward elevation. This is not neutral editing. It reflects a theological position that the Anunnaki should not be seen to suffer from what they themselves decreed. Their authority needed to survive the flood narrative intact. The second is subtler. In both versions, the older Atrahasis and the revised Gilgamesh, the gods make the same error. They destroy humanity and then immediately discover that they need the food offerings humanity provides. Without humans, the gods go hungry. The older text makes this explicit and physical: hunger, thirst, the flies above the sacrifice. The revised text makes it implicit and emotional: fear, retreat, cowering, but the theological problem is identical in both. The gods depend on what they destroyed. The editorial change softens the admission but does not remove it. That dependency, the Anunnaki's reliance on what they attempted to eliminate, is one of the threads that connects the flood narrative to the city lament tradition in a way that has received almost no sustained attention. The Anunnaki do not simply leave Earth. In the oldest accounts, they discover, through the extremity of the flood, that they cannot sustain their own divine existence without it. The broken tablet and the missing council, the fragment, sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. Its catalogue number is CBS 10673. It is a single tablet fired clay, approximately the size of a hand, inscribed on both surfaces in Sumerian cuneiform, and it is one of the most consequential pieces of fired clay in the world, not because of what it says, but because of what it does not say, and because of exactly where it goes silent. The tablet contains what scholars now call the Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving Sumerian account of creation, the establishment of cities, and the Great Flood. It was excavated from the ancient site of Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania's expedition of 1889 to 1900. The tablet was recognized as a significant mythological text by the Assyriologist Arno Peeble in 1912. Subsequent translations and analyses by Samuel Noah Kramer, then by Thorkild Jacobson in his 1981 Journal of Biblical Literature article, the Eridu Genesis refined the reading considerably, though both scholars were working with a text that is, by any measure, badly damaged. The Eridu Genesis begins with a goddess Ninta, the mother of mankind, calling humans from a nomadic existence into settled civilization. She names the first cities Eridu, then Badtabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. She establishes the principle of kingship as divine gift to human society. The text then describes the gods' decision to send a flood, the same decision that drives the Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh narratives, and the warning given to the priest-king Ziusudra, who builds a boat and survives the 7-day deluge. After the flood, Ziusudra prostrates himself before An and Enlil, who grant him breath eternal and send him to Dilmun, the mythological country at the world's eastern edge where the sun rises. The tablet has multiple lacunae sections where the clay is broken, missing, or too damaged to read. What is specifically significant is where the largest single lacuna falls in the narrative sequence. The break comes at the end of the flood account, approximately where the text would be expected to describe the Divine Council's decision about what to do next, the post-flood resolution among the gods about the future of humanity, the future of divine governance, and the nature of the relationship between the Anunnaki and the world they had nearly destroyed. In the Atrahasis, this resolution is the conclusion to which the whole narrative builds. Enki proposes that human mortality, infertility, and the institution of infant death be established as population controls so that humanity will never again grow so numerous as to disturb the gods. Enlil accepts this compromise. The divine order is restored. The Eridu Genesis tablet does not contain this resolution. Whether those missing lines described an Anunnaki withdrawal from active earth governance, a reassignment of divine roles, or something else entirely is a question the break in the clay forecloses. The gap is not ambiguous, it is simply empty. Jacobson, in his 1981 article, was careful about this. His analysis of the tablet's structure suggested that the missing section at the flood narrative's close was probably not long, perhaps enough, to cover the landing of the boat and the final encounter between Ziusudra and the gods, which the surviving text resumes. He did not read the lacuna as a record of Anunnaki withdrawal from earth governance, but he acknowledged that the tablet's structural gaps preclude confident reconstruction of the complete narrative sequence. What is certain is this: CBS 10673 is the oldest substantial Sumerian account of the flood sequence in which the Anunnaki are participants. It predates the Atrahasis as a composition, though the surviving tablet is itself a copy dating to around 1600 BC, and its post-flood section, the part that would tell us how the oldest stratum of the tradition understood the divine aftermath of the flood, is gone. The Atrahasis fills that silence with Enki's population control compromise. The Gilgamesh Standard Version replaces the Atrahasis account with the scene in which Utnapishtim, the flood hero's later name, is granted immortality and sent to live far away, at the mouth of the rivers. Both resolutions preserve the divine order and human continuity. Neither describes the Anunnaki as departing, withdrawing, or reassigning their earth presence. The city lament corpus describes exactly that, and it does so in the most specific terms available in any cuneiform text. The judges below, Inanna's Descent, and the locked court, the Sumerian poem, known as Inanna's Descent into the Netherworld, begins with a list of abandonments. Inanna abandoned heaven, she abandoned earth, she abandoned her duties as high priestess. She abandoned her temples in the great cities Unug, Badtabira, Zabalam, Adab, Nippur, Kish, Akkad, one by one. She set aside the attributes of her divine power, her crown, her measuring rod, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her pectoral, her robe. The poem names each item as it is removed. The stripping is methodical. By the time Inanna reaches the gate of the underworld, she has nothing left but her mortality. What awaits her inside the underworld is the Anunnaki. In this composition, catalogued in the Etsy CSL as text 1.4. 1. Translated by Samuel Noah Kramer and Diane Walkstein in their 1983 study Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, with supplementary Akkadian material translated by Stephanie Daly in Myths from Mesopotamia, 1989. The Anunnaki appear as 7 judges who reside permanently in the underworld and preside over its court. They sit in judgment. Inanna is brought before them. They fasten their eyes on her, the text says, and that look alone the gaze of the Anunnaki from their fixed judicial positions is enough to kill the goddess. She is hung on a hook on the wall like a piece of meat. The Anunnaki in this text are not agents of any active cosmological process. They are not decreeing the fates of humanity, not engaged with the world's governance, not presiding over the agricultural cycles or the kingship or the flood. They are sitting. They are waiting for cases to come before them. Their relationship to the world above is entirely juridical. They receive the dead and judge them, and that is all. The Akkadian version of the same composition, dated to the early 2nd millennium BC and translated by Daly, preserves a passage in which Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, commands her servant to seat the Anunnaki on golden thrones and bring them water. The hospitality gesture is revealing. These are not beings who recently arrived. They are being refreshed in the way that permanent residents require refreshment, with the implication that without the servant's attention, they would sit in thirst indefinitely. Here the second debt planted earlier in this investigation demands resolution. The same word Anunna in Sumerian, Anunnaki in Akkadian, appears in the 3rd dynasty of Ur texts as a designation for heaven and earth presences who decree human fate from active positions of engagement, and in Inanna's descent as a designation for a fixed court of underworld judges who drink water in a hall below the earth and kill goddesses with their gaze. The word is phonetically the same. The ontological content has been reversed. Jeremy Black and Anthony Green's 1992 dictionary documents this shift explicitly, but without fully accounting for why it happened or when. The terminological split they describe Anunnaki below, Igigi above, formalized in the Middle Babylonian period, is the end of a process, not the process itself. The process is visible, partially, in the gap between the Ur-3 texts and the Atrahasis, and more clearly in the gap between the Atrahasis and the later Akkadian Inanna's descent. Across that gap, the Anunnaki moved. The movement was gradual. It was also, in the evidence available, undocumented no text says the Anunnaki were previously earth presences and have now been reassigned to the underworld. The reassignment happens between the texts, in the spaces where scribes chose not to explain what they were doing. Whether the Anunnaki's underworld role was always a component of Sumerian theology, a lower world function existing alongside their upper world function, which the older Earth presence role eventually eclipsed, or was eclipsed by, is a question that Jacobson raised in The Treasures of Darkness and left open. His tentative position was that the Anunnaki's underworld association grew stronger as Mesopotamian cosmological thinking became more systematic about dividing the universe into zones with fixed divine jurisdictions. The systematization required placement. Every god needed an assigned location. The Anunnaki, whose original identity was fluid and earth-engaged, were assigned to the underworld as theological order-making demanded it. That assignment feels, in the oldest texts, like something imposed rather than something native. The Anunnaki judges who kill Inanna with their gaze have none of the texture of the Anunna who sing hymns to Enki and take up their dwellings among the Sumerians. The institutional weight of the underworld court sits on them heavily, like a garment fitted to a body it was not made for. Whether that impression reflects an actual historical development in Sumerian theology, or only a modern reader's sense of incongruity, is precisely the kind of question this investigation cannot resolve. It can only hold. The sheepfold and the open door, City laments the comparison, is exact in the original Sumerian, which is why it matters. In the Lament for compiled by Samuel Noah Kramer, from fragments including the University of Pennsylvania Museum tablets CBS 2204, 2270, 2302, and 99751, and additional pieces from the Louvre, the Ashmolean, and the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, the central image of divine departure, is a sheepfold. The patron gods leave their cities like shepherds abandoning their sheepfolds. The temples stand empty. The poem's speaker, the goddess Ningal, wife of the moon god Nanna, describes standing before An and Enlil in the divine assembly and pleading with them not to destroy They do not listen. The city's destruction is decreed, and the gods leave. The passage is worth the attention it demands. Ningal's speech to the divine assembly reads, in Thorkild Jacobson's 1987 translation, in the Harps That Once, Sumerian Poetry and Translation, I verily clasp legs, laid hold of arms, truly I shed my tears before An, truly I made supplication, I myself before Enlil, may my city not be ravaged. I said to them, may not be ravaged, the council of gods hears her, they do not change their decision. And then, one by one, the named deities abandon their temples. Ninlil leaves the key and lets the breezes haunt her sheepfold. Ninmar leaves Kesh. Enki leaves Eridu. The wild bull of Eridug has abandoned it and has let the breezes haunt his sheepfold. 5 city laments survive in the cuneiform record: the Lament for the Lament for Sumer and edited by Piotr Michalowski in his 1989 Eisenbrowns, study the Lament for Nippur, the Lament for Eridu, and the Lament for Uruk. All 5 share the same structural feature. The gods are described departing their cities in response to divine decree, and the cities then fall to enemy armies, to political collapse, to the broader catastrophe of the 3rd dynasty of Ur's end around 2004 BCE. The theological logic of the city laments operates differently from the flood narratives. In the flood accounts, Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, Gilgamesh Tablet C, the Anunnaki, are agents of catastrophe, initiating destruction and then responding to it. In the city laments, the Anunnaki are not agents. They are departing presences whose absence creates the vulnerability that allows catastrophe to occur. The city falls because its god has left, not because its god decided to destroy it. The sequence is inverted. Departure precedes catastrophe. In the flood accounts, catastrophe precedes departure. This inversion is theologically significant. It suggests that the city lament tradition preserves a different understanding of divine withdrawal than the flood narrative tradition, one in which departure is not a response to human noise or divine frustration, but something decided in the assembly of the gods for reasons the lament poems consistently describe as mysterious. Decrees whose content the supplicating goddess cannot change, and the lament priests cannot explain. In the Lament for Sumer and the destruction of the Sumerian cities by the Elamites and the Amorites is framed not as divine punishment for human sin, but as the working out of a fate already assigned by An and Enlil for reasons that remain opaque. The people of Sumer did nothing, the text implies, that particularly deserved what happened to them. The gods simply left. Now the first debt planted near the beginning of this investigation reaches its resolution. The Gilgamesh tablets see, passage the Anunnaki lifted up the torches, setting the land ablaze, and the city lament images of gods departing like shepherds, abandoning their sheepfolds, use related imagery for irreconcilable narrative purposes. In Gilgamesh, the torch lifting is a prelude to the flood itself, an act within a catastrophe the Anunnaki are initiating. In the city laments, the departure precedes the catastrophe and enables it by creating divine absence, same imagery of divine action and divine withdrawal. Opposite causal sequences. The scholarly tradition has not fully reckoned with this inversion, partly because the city lament corpus and the flood narrative tradition are usually treated as separate bodies of evidence addressing separate historical events, the flood as primordial mythology, the city laments as responses to the specific political catastrophe of the Ur-3 collapse. But if both bodies of evidence are taken seriously as records of how Sumerian scribes understood divine withdrawal from human affairs, the inversion becomes a fact that needs accounting for. There is a translation problem embedded in the city lament corpus that sharpens this question. A specific Sumerian verbal form, the one translated variously as abandoned or left in the departure passages, was rendered differently by Kramer in 1940 and Jacobson in 1987. Kramer's reading emphasized the passive dimension of the verb. The gods were removed from their cities by divine decree, displaced by a decision made above them. Jacobson's later translation emphasized the active dimension. The gods abandoned their shrines, walking away under their own divine volition. The original Sumerian verbal form supports both readings. Sumerian verbs of this class can carry both active and passive force depending on context, and in the lament texts the context is genuinely ambiguous. The gods appear to leave in response to a decree, which makes the action simultaneously voluntary and commanded. That ambiguity departure, as both chosen and decreed, is the city lament tradition's most precise theological statement. The Anunnaki leave because they are told to leave, and because apparently they choose to leave when told. The sheepfold image serves both readings. A shepherd abandons the fold, but the fold was always something the shepherd would eventually leave. The scribe who changed the line, sometime between 1300 and 1000, bis the dates are approximate. The attribution traditional, a scholar whose name has been preserved as Snelki Uninni, produced what Assyriologists call the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He did not write the epic. He edited it, synthesized it, extended it, and gave it the 12-tablet structure that survives most completely in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The tablet excavated in 1852, K103375, the one this investigation opened with, is his editorial work, or work produced in his scribal tradition. What Snelki Uninni's editorial choices reveal about the theological concerns of his period is one that Geoffrey Tigai's 1982 study placed on the scholarly table and that the field has not exhaustively worked through. Tigai was interested primarily in the evolution of the epic as a literary phenomenon. His chapter on the flood narrative's relationship to the Atrahasis is meticulous and careful, but his interest was in the editorial process rather than in the theological motivation behind it. The motivation, however, is traceable. Consider the 3 documented changes to Anunnaki descriptions between the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh Tablet C. The first, the Anunnaki was sitting in thirst, and hunger becomes, in the Gilgamesh version, the gods feared the deluge. The substitution removes physical embodiment and replaces it with emotional abstraction. A god sitting in hunger is a god whose divine sustenance depends on the sacrificial offerings of the humans it has destroyed, a deeply uncomfortable theological admission, and one that the Atrahasis makes without apparent discomfort. A god who fears the deluge is a god whose majesty is temporarily overwhelmed by a force even it cannot control, but whose essential nature remains intact. The revision preserves divine dignity. The original did not bother to. The second, the description of the gods gathering at the flood survivors' sacrificial offerings as pressing together like flies Kamar-Zub in Akkadian, an explicitly undignified simile that makes divine beings resemble insects drawn to blood, is softened in the Gilgamesh version. The image of the gods swarming the offerings survives, but the explicitly debasing simile is reduced. What the older text stated plainly, that the gods' dependence on human sacrifice was so complete that they behaved like flies above carrion, the revised version preferred to approach obliquely. The third is the subtlest. In Atrahasis, the goddess Beletili raises her voice against Enlil after the flood, crying why, the greatest warrior of all gods. Didn't you fight the rebels instead of creating humans and letting things come to this? The accusation is theological. The flood and all the suffering it caused, including the gods' own hunger and the destruction of their food supply, was a consequence of Enlil's decision to create humans as a labour substitute for the rebellious Igigi. Enlil created the problem he then tried to solve with the flood. Bela-Ili says so directly. In the Gilgamesh Standard Version, her outburst is preserved, but its edge is dulled. The specific accusation against Enlil's original decision is less pointed, the causal chain less clearly drawn. Taken together, these 3 changes move in a single direction. They reduce the Anunnaki's vulnerability, reduce their dependence on humanity, and reduce the theological embarrassment of the flood narrative's central irony that the gods destroyed what sustained them and then discovered their mistake immediately. The standard version of the Gilgamesh epic is a more theologically dignified text than the Atrahasis. It is also less honest about what the oldest stratum of the tradition recorded. What the editor preserved is equally informative. The Gilgamesh Standard Version retains the image of the gods cowering like dogs by the outer wall. This too is a debasing simile gods as frightened animals, pressed against architecture for shelter. The editor removed the physical suffering, but kept the cowardice. That choice is strange. Why retain an undignified image while removing the specific physical content that explained it? One possible reading: the cowering image was already too widely known, too thoroughly embedded in the oral performance tradition that surrounded the epic, to be removed without the alteration becoming obvious. The hunger and thirst passages may have been less prominent, less frequently cited in performance, and therefore more safely cut. The editorial arithmetic of a literary tradition operating within a scribal culture is not the same as scholarly editing. The scribe who changed the line worked within constraints of what an audience would tolerate as revision. What the editor of the standard version preserved, in other words, may not be what that editor most valued. It may be what that editor could not afford to lose without losing credibility. And what was cut the embodied vulnerability, the explicit dependence on human sacrifice, the direct accusation against divine decision-making, was what the theological moment required to be softened. The tablet in the British Museum is both the revision and the evidence of the revision. It cannot help being both. The Babylonian solution, assigning stations the Enma Eli, does not describe the Anunnaki departing Earth. It describes them receiving assignments. The Babylonian creation epic, whose standard version is dated to the 1st millennium BC, though its mythological material is older builds to its climax in the Anunnaki's gratitude toward Marduk, the champion of the gods, who defeated the primordial chaos, goddess Tiamat, and used her body to construct heaven and earth. In gratitude for their deliverance, the Anunnaki build for Marduk a splendid temple Esagila, the great ziggurat of Babylon, and Marduk in return assigns each of the Anunnaki their stations, their offices, their permanent positions within the newly organised cosmos. E.A. Spizer's translation in James B. Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts relating to the Old Testament renders the relevant passage as Marduk establishing the Anunnaki in their cosmic roles 300 to the heaven, 600 to the underworld, in a late Babylonian count that Black and Green cite in their 1992 dictionary. The numbers themselves are late and likely schematic rather than theologically precise. What matters is the principle. The Enma Eli understands the Anunnaki's cosmic positions as assigned, fixed, administrative. They did not arrive at their locations through narrative through the events of the flood, or the cosmological separation, or the abandonment of specific cities. They were placed there by Marduk's authority. This is a fundamentally different account of how the Anunnaki came to occupy their various positions than anything in the older Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian texts show the Anunnaki in locations on Earth, in the underworld, in the divine assembly through narrative processes that involve conflict, decision, departure, and consequence. The Enma Eli removes the narrative. The Anunnaki's placement is organisational from the start. Marduk is the executive. The Anunnaki are the organisation's permanent staff. The theological benefit of this arrangement, from a Babylonian perspective, is substantial. An Anunnaki who was assigned its cosmic station by Marduk cannot be described as having left Earth in response to a catastrophe, or having been displaced by theological redistribution, or having abandoned a city because of a divine council's decree. It was always in its assigned position. The concept of departure doesn't apply to a position. What the city lament tradition recorded gods walking away from temples, leaving sheepfolds open, letting the breezes in, is theologically incoherent within the Enma Eli framework. If Marduk assigned the Anunnaki to the underworld is where they were always supposed to be. The city temples were never, in this cosmological scheme, their permanent residences. The administrative solution is elegant. It is also, as a response to the older tradition's complexity, a simplification so thorough that it erases the problem by denying the conditions under which the problem arose. Two traditions now stand irreconcilably in the field of evidence. The Sumerian city lament tradition records named Anunnaki deities departing named temples in named cities in response to specific divine decrees, with the consequence being those cities' political destruction. The Babylonian Enma-Eli tradition records Anunnaki deities as permanently stationed beings whose cosmic positions were assigned at the moment of creation. These two accounts cannot both be accurate descriptions of the same theological reality. They are not variations on the same understanding. They represent two different answers to the question of where the Anunnaki are and how they got there. The clay of the British Museum's Enma-Eli fragment holds one answer. The clay of the Penn Museum's Lament tablets, the Istanbul fragments, the Louvre shards, the Ashmolean pieces all hold another. They were all fired in Mesopotamian kilns. They all survive. They will not reconcile themselves. Error's War and Marduk's Departure, the poem of Error, was composed, most scholars agree, in the 8th century BC, though some Assyriologists argue for the 7th. Its author is named in the colophon Kabti Ilni Marduk, who claims to have received the composition in a dream. It survives in multiple copies across several sites, translated by Stephanie Daly in her 1989 study Myths from Mesopotamia. The poem's central situation is this: Marduk has left Babylon. He has not left in response to a flood, or because of a divine council's decree, or because of any specific human failing. He left because his statues and temples had fallen into disrepair, because the divine craftsman who created the images of the gods had withdrawn to the underworld, because, in a formulation that the poem treats as both cause and symptom, simultaneously the civilizational order that Marduk's presence sustained had begun to erode. Marduk's departure is the catastrophe, not the response to one. Without him, the war god Error fills the power vacuum and begins destroying Babylon. This is the city lament motif, displaced into a later theological register. The structural logic is identical. Divine presence sustains the city. Divine departure creates the vulnerability through which destruction enters. The city's fall is the consequence of the god having left. But the poem of Error's version of this logic operates within the Enma-Eli cosmological world, where Marduk is supreme and the Anunnaki are his administrative subordinates. The poem cannot simply say the Anunnaki abandoned Babylon in the way the lament for Ur said Enki abandoned Eridu. It has to root the same theological event through Marduk's singular authority. The convergence is striking. Two entirely independent literary traditions, the Sumerian city lament corpus, composed in response to the fall of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2004 BC, and the Akkadian poem of Error, composed somewhere between 800 and 700 BC, arrive at the same structural image of divine departure preceding and enabling urban catastrophe. They do so through different theological frameworks, serving different theological purposes, in different languages and different centuries. The image persists because it corresponds to something in how Mesopotamian culture understood the relationship between divine presence and civilizational stability. Among the Anunnaki's appearances in the poem of Error, the most telling is one that Daly's translation handles as a description of the Anunnaki's greatness in the past, in contrast to their diminished role in the poem's present. The poem expresses a kind of theological nostalgia, a sense that the Anunnaki once had a different, more active, more potent relationship to the world than they currently occupy. This nostalgia is the poem of Error's acknowledgement, however indirect, that something in the Anunnaki's situation has changed across time. The poem cannot account for the change because it operates within a cosmological framework that denies the older dynamic ever existed, but the nostalgia escapes the framework's control. Two irreconcilable traditions converging on the same structural image from entirely different starting points cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Either they drew on a shared cultural memory of what divine withdrawal from human affairs felt like a memory transmitted without a single canonical text to preserve it, or they independently arrived at the same structural insight about the relationship between presence, absence, and catastrophe. Both possibilities are, in their different ways, remarkable. The King List and the Silence at the Seam-the-Well Blundell Prism Catalogue number AN 1923.444 in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, presented by Herbert Well Blundell in 1923, is a four-sided vertical clay prism inscribed with two columns of cuneiform on each face. It dates to approximately 1800 BCE. It is the most complete surviving copy of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that enumerates the rulers of Sumer from the mythological beginning of organised kingship to the historical period of the Isin dynasty. The King List's opening formula has become one of the most cited passages in all of ancient Mesopotamian literature. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. In Eridug, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Those antediluvian reigns, 8 kings reigning for a combined 241,200 years before the flood are followed by the flood itself, and then by the resumption of kingship after the waters recede. The post-flood formula reads, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The Anunnaki are not mentioned in this transition. This is the King List's sharpest silence, and it is worth sitting with. The document spans the entire scope of Sumerian historical self-understanding from mythological time through to the early 2nd millennium BC, and at the moment of the most significant structural transition in its scheme, the moment when divine kingship gives way to human kingship after the flood, the beings who were. In the Year 3 literary tradition, the primary agents of fate decreeing and earth governance are entirely absent from the record. They do not appear to sanction the new kings. They do not appear to withdraw. They are simply not there. The absence could mean many things. It could mean that by the time the Well Blundell Prism was compiled around 1800 BCE. In the Old Babylonian period, the Anunnaki's role in the governance of human affairs was sufficiently abstract and cosmological that naming them at the flood transition would have felt redundant. It could mean that the King List's administrative genre simply did not accommodate the kind of divine role commentary that the literary compositions preserved. Administrative lists record who held the office. They do not always explain the theological mechanism by which the office operates. But the WB62 tablet complicates this reading. WB62 is a separate King List variant tablet that provides a different chronology from the Well Blundell Prism. Among its differences is a detail absent from the main Well Blundell text. It names a king called Atrahasis as a ruler of Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero, in the period immediately before the flood. The Atrahasis of WB62 is listed as a Gudug priest, a temple priest, and is preceded by his father Shuruppak, who is in turn preceded by Ubaratutu. This creates a genealogical chain placing the flood hero within the administrative lineage of the pre-flood kingship. The implication is significant. If Atrahasis, the figure who survived the flood through his relationship with the god Enki, who received divine knowledge about the coming catastrophe and acted on it, was a named king priest in the Shurupak lineage. Then the flood transition in the king list was not simply a gap between divine and human governance. It was a moment when a figure who bridged the divine and human categories was present, and the main World Blundell prism chose not to record him. The World Blundell prism omits Atrahasis entirely. The flood transition is unmarked, the divine kingship simply resuming in human form at Kish without any named mediating figure. WB 62 places a named priest-king at the seam. The two versions of the same document disagree about whether the transition between divine and human governance had a witnessed human face. What the Anunnaki were doing at that moment, whether the king list's silence represents their orderly withdrawal. Their administrative irrelevance to a human governance document, or a deliberate editorial choice by the World Blundell Prism's compilers, is a question the document cannot answer from within itself. It can only be held against the other documents that were willing to describe the same moment differently. Before the final section, if you have stayed this long, you are the audience this investigation exists for. What comes next does not resolve into a clean answer. It resolves into the honest shape of what the evidence allows, which is something harder and more durable than resolution. Stay for it. 3 ways of reading the withdrawal 5 bodies of evidence now lie across the investigation's surface, each internally consistent, none fully compatible with the others. The first body, the Atrahasis flood account, in which the Anunnaki experience physical suffering during the flood, hunger, thirst, grief, and then resolve their relationship with humanity through a compromise that limits human reproduction. In this account, the Anunnaki do not depart Earth. They renegotiate their terms. The compromise amounts to an acknowledgement that humanity and the Anunnaki are in an inextricable dependency relationship. Neither can exist without the other. The Anunnaki's apparent departure in this text is not a departure at all. It is a moment of nearly breaking apart, followed by a decision to continue. The second body, the Gilgamesh Standard version, in which the Anunnaki cower, retreat to the heaven of Anu, and afterward function primarily as presences who set the land aflame and judge the dead. The flood is a moment of divine recoil. The Anunnaki withdraw upward and inward, taking with them the active earth governance that the Sumerian texts had attributed to them. The third body, the city lament corpus, in which named Anunnaki deities are described departing specific temples in specific cities in response to specific divine decrees, and doing so in a context that makes their departure not a cosmic event but a liturgical and political one, tied to the specific historical catastrophe of the Ur-3 collapse. These departures are witnessed, described in detail, and mourned in compositions that were performed liturgically as part of temple restoration ceremonies. The fourth body, the Enma Eli, in which the Anunnaki's positions are assigned by Marduk at the moment of creation, making the concept of their departure from Earth cosmologically incoherent. They were never on Earth in any sense that could produce a departure. They were always in their assigned stations. The city lament traditions theological claim that divine presence sustained cities and divine absence destroyed them cannot be stated within the Enma Eli framework without dismantling it. The fifth body, the poem of error, in which the structural logic of the city laments reappears inside the Enma Eli cosmological world. Routed through Marduk's singular authority, but recognizable as the same logic, divine departure precedes and enables urban catastrophe. The poem's nostalgia for an older kind of Anunnaki greatness is not accidental. It is the theological pressure of the older tradition pushing through the seams of the newer one. 3 interpretive positions organise these 5 bodies differently. The first position, which might be called the literary symbolic reading, holds that the Anunnaki departure motif in any of these texts is primarily a literary device for explaining catastrophe in theological terms. The Anunnaki leave because the scribes needed an explanation for why bad things happened to sophisticated civilizations, and divine abandonment was their explanatory category. The city laments are not records of anything that actually happened in any theologically meaningful sense. They are liturgical responses to historical events, dressed in divine narrative. The second position, which might be called the encoded theology reading, holds that the departure motif in the city lament corpus preserves a genuine Sumerian theological understanding of divine power as locally present and locally withdrawable, that the Anunnaki were understood as genuinely resident in their temples, not in the abstract sense of being represented there, but in the specific sense that Mesopotamian theology took cult statues to be real embodiments of divine presence. When the statue was removed, the god had left. The departures in the lament texts are descriptions of the removal of cult statues from temples during the abandonment and sacking of cities' actual events physically occurring, framed in the theological language of divine volition. The third position holds that the city lament corpus preserves a strand of Sumerian theological understanding that was systematically absorbed, revised, and finally made incoherent by the Babylonian theological project, which culminated in the Enma Eli. The Anunnaki's earth presence was a genuine component of Sumerian theological thought. The departure motif in the city laments is not only liturgical response, but theological record, a record that the Babylonian administrative cosmology of the Enma Eli could not accommodate, and therefore rerouted. The 5 bodies of evidence are not 5 descriptions of the same event. They are 5 stages in the theological processing of a problem, the problem of how to account for what the Anunnaki once were and what they became. The verbal ambiguity in the city laments Kramer's removed versus Jacobson's abandoned resolves itself here, at least partially. If the second interpretive position is correct, the ambiguity is not a translation problem. It is an accurate description of what the theological tradition understood about divine withdrawal, simultaneously chosen and decreed, active and passive, the god both leaving and being released. If the third position is correct, the verbal ambiguity reflects the city lament scribes' own uncertainty about the theological mechanism they were recording, a tradition describing a kind of divine behaviour that their theology had not fully theorized. The ambiguity was in the original understanding, not in the translation. Jacobson argued, across his body of work, that the best scholarship on Mesopotamian religion resisted the temptation to force any of these positions into exclusivity. The textual record is not clean enough, and the tradition is not simple enough to support the kind of certainty that a single interpretive position would require. This investigation cannot disagree. The counter-arguments and the weight they carry before the 5 bodies of evidence are interpreted against each other in final terms. They have to survive a challenge more fundamental than any detail within them. The challenge comes from within the scholarly tradition this investigation has relied on throughout, not from outside critics unfamiliar with the material, but from the people who know it best. Stating it fully and taking it seriously is the only way to know whether what this investigation has built actually stands. The objection deserves its space. The strongest objection can be stated plainly: there is no coherent Anunnaki departure tradition. What exists is a set of texts composed over more than 1,000 years in 2 languages, across multiple scribal traditions and theological contexts, which variously describe divine withdrawal, divine suffering, divine assignment, and divine absence in ways that are sufficiently thematically related to be discussed together, but insufficiently unified to constitute a single tradition about a single event or process. The appearance of coherence is produced by the investigation itself, by selecting these 5 bodies of evidence, treating them as a conversation, and imposing a narrative arc on material that was not produced with any such arc in mind. This is a serious objection. It is the position implicit in much of the academic work on Mesopotamian religion, which tends to treat the flood narrative tradition, the city lament corpus, the underworld literature, and the Babylonian creation epic as distinct genres addressing distinct theological concerns, not as chapters in a single developing argument about divine departure. Piotr Michalowski's 1989 study of the lament for Sumer and Ur is careful, in precisely this way, to contextualize the city laments as literary responses to specific historical circumstances, the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, rather than as records of theological events with broader implications. His textual analysis is meticulous, and his resistance to over-reading the laments as evidence for anything beyond their immediate literary and liturgical function is methodologically responsible. Michalowski does not interpret the city laments as evidence of a wider Anunnaki departure narrative. He reads them as Sumerian compositions doing what Sumerian literary compositions do, processing collective trauma through theological and literary form. Jacobson's own position in Treasures of Darkness is more nuanced than a simple rejection of the synthesis this investigation has attempted, but it is not an endorsement of it either. Jacobson saw the evolution of Mesopotamian religious thought as a genuine development gods moving from nature-power associations to personal relationships with individual worshippers in his schema, but he was careful not to claim that any single theological development could be read from a unified tradition. The textual record was too fragmented, too geographically dispersed, too chronologically extended to support that reading. Against these cautions, the investigation has 2 responses. The first is Geoffrey Tigai's documented editorial changes. Tigai's work is not interpretive, it is textual. The changes between the Atrahasis flood account and the Gilgamesh Standard Version are verifiable in the tablets themselves. The direction of those changes consistently reducing the Anunnaki's embodied vulnerability and increasing their abstract elevation is a fact, not an interpretation. Something was being done to the textual record by identifiable agents in a consistent direction. Whether that editorial project was conscious theological revision or the unconscious drift of a tradition over time, its effect on the record is the same. The older description of the Anunnaki's flood moment vulnerability was progressively obscured. The second response is the city laments themselves. These texts were not composed as theological speculation. They were liturgical documents used in temple restoration ceremonies, intended to be performed as part of official religious practice. Their description of named Anunnaki deities leaving named temples was not a private scholarly opinion. It was the official liturgical understanding of what had happened when cities fell. The Babylonian theological project that produced the Enma Eli had to contend with a liturgical tradition that described divine withdrawal as both real and politically consequential. The Enma Eli's administrative cosmology, Anunnaki, as permanently stationed by Marduk, was not composed in a vacuum. It was composed in a tradition where the city lament understanding of divine withdrawal had institutional authority. The possibility that the Enma Eli was, in part, a theological response to the city lament tradition, replacing a departure-capable Earth, present Anunnaki, with a station-fixed administrative one, the evidence does not confirm. The evidence does not rule it out. Those are not the same statement, and the difference between them is where this investigation lives. The investigation cannot resolve the counter-argument. It can only note that the objection that there is no coherent tradition is itself one reading of the evidence, not a fact that overrides all others. The evidence that something in the textual tradition changed, consistently and across multiple genres, in the direction of reducing Anunnaki Earth presence and increasing their cosmological distance, is real. What produced that change, deliberate theological revision, organic doctrinal evolution, or the normal drift of a textual tradition across centuries, is, honestly, not something that can be settled from the surviving clay. The strongest thing this investigation can say is also its most modest. The Sumerian texts preserve something that the Babylonian texts progressively de-emphasized. What that something was a coherent tradition, a set of related understandings, a theological intuition that the Anunnaki had once been more present and had become less so, the older texts record in the only way clay can record anything: without interpretation, without revision. In the fixed depth of stylus marks pressed into wet earth 4,000 years ago by a hand that expected no one in particular to read them. What the clay remembers there is a particular weight to fired clay that you do not expect the first time you hold it. Not heavy, exactly more dense than its size suggests, as though the material compresses itself when it hardens, pulls inward, refuses to give anything away lightly. CBS 10673 sits in a climate-controlled environment in Philadelphia, in a city that did not exist when the tablet was pressed, on a continent the scribe who made it had no means of imagining. Under magnification, the stylus marks are still individually visible, each wedge pressed at a particular angle, with a particular depth, by a hand that moved in trained sequences. Following signs learned over years of scribal education in the schoolhouses of Nippur, the clay was river clay, most likely from the Euphrates alluvium. It was kneaded, shaped, smoothed, and pressed while still wet, then fired to preserve whatever had been written on it. What had been written on it was a version of the oldest surviving Sumerian account of the beginning of civilization, the first cities, the flood, and what came after, and then, at the place where what came after should have been, the clay broke, or was never completed, or continued on another surface now lost. The gap is there in the record. It has been there since 1893, when the University of Pennsylvania's expedition pulled the tablet from the soil of Nippur and carried it across the world to be catalogued, translated, disputed, and partially understood. This investigation began with two incompatible images: the Anunnaki cowering like dogs by the outer wall of heaven, and the Anunnaki departing their temples like shepherds leaving sheepfolds open to the wind. It ends not having collapsed them into one, they remain incompatible. They are from different texts, different centuries, different theological frameworks, different scribal traditions, with different things at stake. The investigation has traced the line of divergence between them through the editorial changes documented by Tegay, through the ontological drift documented by Black and Green, through the city lament descriptions translated by Kramer and Jacobson, through the administrative cosmology of the Enmerili, through the nostalgic counter-pressure of the Poem of Error, through the King List's silence at the flood seam, and WB62's dissenting notation. The title of this investigation claimed that every record lied about how the Anunnaki left Earth, and that Sumerian texts preserved what really happened. That claim requires one final calibration. The records did not lie. Exactly, they edited. They revised. They replaced older formulations with newer ones that served different theological purposes. They made choices about what to keep and what to soften and what to route through a cosmological framework that made the older understanding structurally incoherent. Snell C. Unnini's editorial tradition did not falsify the Atrahasis. It produced a text for a different audience with different concerns. The Enmerili did not erase the city lament tradition. It built a cosmological system within which the city lament tradition simply could not find perches, and the Sumerian texts did preserve something. Whether it was what really happened, which is a category the ancient texts themselves do not use. Because for the scribes of Nippur and and Eridu, the distinction between historical event and theological understanding was not the same distinction it is for us, is a question the clay cannot answer. What the clay preserves is the shape of the understanding before revision, the form of the theological sense-making before the administrative cosmology arrived to assign everyone a fixed station. The scribe who wrote on CBS 1673, sometime around 1600 BCE, was copying an older composition in a city that was already old. The hand moved in trained sequences. The stylus pressed at particular angles. The account of the flood was recorded, and then the gods convened to decide what came next, and then the tablet broke, or ended, or continued on another surface now lost. What the gods decided at that council about their relationship to Earth, the question that sits in the gap, is a question that fired clay carried across 4,000 years without answering. It is still carrying it. The temple and the body, what residents actually meant before the investigation, moves into the final bodies of evidence. A foundational assumption needs to be examined, one that has operated quietly beneath every section preceding this one, shaping the way every departure, every withdrawal, every editorial softening has been read. The assumption is this: when the Sumerian texts say a god lived in a temple, they mean something different from what a modern reader instinctively hears. In contemporary religious understanding, shaped by centuries of traditions that locate the divine primarily in the immaterial, in spirit, in consciousness, in an omnipresence that does not depend on physical coordinates, the idea of a god residing somewhere functions as metaphor. The god is honoured there. The god is invoked there. The god is symbolically present there. The building is a house for the idea of the divine, not for the divine itself. This is not what the Sumerian texts mean, and the gap between what they mean and what modern readers hear them saying is large enough to distort every claim this investigation has been tracking. The Mesopotamian understanding of divine residence was what scholars of ancient religion call a theology of real presence, not symbolic or representational presence, but literal, physical, ontologically actual presence. The cult statue installed in a temple's inner sanctuary was not an image of the god. It was, in the specific technical theological sense that Mesopotamian ritual practice operated within, the god's body. The god inhabited the statue the way a person inhabits a physical form. The statue ate ritual meals were prepared and placed before it twice daily. It slept, the sanctuary was sealed at night so the god could rest undisturbed. It travelled cult statues, were carried in procession during festivals, visiting neighbouring temples, crossing rivers on ceremonial barges, and it could leave, not metaphorically. The god could depart the statue, depart the temple, depart the city, and when it did, the city was, in the most rigorous theological sense the tradition possessed, abandoned. The textual evidence for this understanding is extensive and comes from multiple periods. The MSP ritual, the mouth-washing ceremony, documented in tablets from the 1st millennium BC, translated by Christopher Walker and Michael Dick in their 2001 study, The Induction of the Divine Image, was performed on newly crafted cult statues to transfer the divine presence into the physical object. The ceremony involved a sequence of ritual actions that progressively separated the statue from the human craftsman who made it. The statue was made to declare that its hands were not the hands of a human craftsman, but the hands of the gods Ea and Asaluhi, and concluded with the installation of the divine presence within the physical form. The god and the statue were, after the ceremony, a single thing. This matters for the city lament corpus in a way that the purely literary reading of those texts does not fully accommodate. When the lament for Ur describes Enki abandoning Eridu and letting the breezes haunt his sheepfold, it is describing something that had a specific physical referent, the removal of Enki's cult statue from the Abzu temple at Eridu. The god did not leave in the way a spirit or presence dissolves the god left in the way a physical body leaves a location. The cult statue was carried out, the inner sanctuary stood empty, and the god was, by every measure available to the theological tradition, gone. The Babylonian term for this event is Rebil, the going out of the gods. It is attested in royal inscriptions from multiple periods as a description of divine departure that precedes military defeat, and its opposite. Erbil, the entering of the gods, describes the return of the cult statues during city restoration, the event that the city lament compositions were liturgically designed to facilitate. The laments were performed not only as elegies for what had been lost, but as part of the ritual technology for persuading the gods to return. They were, in the most practical sense, theological engineering. The Anunnaki's departure from the Sumerian cities was, in this light, neither metaphorical nor mysterious. It was the physical removal of the objects in which the divine was held to reside. Whether those removals were deliberate statues carried away by retreating priests ahead of an invading army, or forced statues captured as war trophies by conquering Elamites or Amorites, the theological consequence was the same. The god was gone. The city was empty of its most essential resident. The political catastrophe that followed was not a punishment for religious failure. It was the natural consequence of the city having been, in the only sense the tradition cared about, vacated. Understanding this shifts the investigation's earlier question about what the Anunnaki's departure actually was. The terminological drift from Earth, present Anunnaki in the Ur-3 texts to underworld judiciary Anunnaki in the Middle Babylonian period, was not only a change in theological vocabulary, it tracked a change in what the tradition understood divine residence to consist of and what it meant when residence ended. The scribal schools and the problem of curriculum there is a dimension of the Anunnaki textual tradition that almost no popular account has examined, and it is one of the most structurally important facts in the entire investigation. The texts that preserved the oldest Anunnaki descriptions did not survive accidentally. They survived because they were school texts. The Adaba, the Sumerian word for the scribal school, literally tablet house, was the institution through which Mesopotamian literary culture reproduced itself. Prospective scribes spent years copying standard compositions, progressing from simple sign lists and administrative formulae to the complex literary texts that formed the core of the scholarly curriculum. The compositions a scribal school chose to include in its curriculum were the compositions that would survive, because they were copied over and over by generation after generation of students. The compositions a school did not include were the compositions that stood the highest chance of being lost, as the tablets that contained them deteriorated and were not replaced. The composition known as Inanna's Descent into the Netherworld, the text in which the Anunnaki appear as underworld judges, was a standard curriculum text in the Nippur scribal schools of the Old Babylonian period. Multiple student copies survive from this period, representing different stages of the copying process, including student errors subsequently corrected by teachers. The text was taught. It was maintained. It was reproduced with institutional consistency across generations of scribal education. The composition known as Enki and the World Order, the text in which the Anunnaki take up their dwellings among the Sumerian population as earth-present governing deities, was also a curriculum text, though its survival pattern is different. The copies that survive show more variation between them than the Inanna's Descent copies do, suggesting that it was transmitted through a slightly less standardized scribal tradition, or that the surviving copies represent different regional scribal traditions, copying from slightly different source texts. The Atrahasis epic the text that contains the flood account, with the Anunnaki sitting in hunger and thirst, survives in a different pattern again. Its most complete Old Babylonian copies are not student tablets. They are what scholars classify as library tablets, large, carefully executed copies made for preservation rather than for teaching. The Atrahasis does not appear to have been a standard curriculum text in the Nippur schools in the way that Inanna's Descent was. This has a direct consequence for the investigation. A text that is copied by hundreds of students over centuries is a text that survives robustly in multiple exemplars, with corruptions and variants well distributed across copies. A text preserved primarily in library copies survives more precariously if the library is destroyed, the text is gone. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the library from which K3375, the Gilgamesh Tablet C, was excavated, was, among its other functions, a systematic collection of Babylonian literary and scholarly texts assembled under royal commission. Ashurbanipal sent agents to Babylonian temple libraries and private scribal collections to copy texts for the Nineveh library. The texts that were collected were, in part, the texts that were already institutionally valued, the texts that temple libraries and scribal families had already chosen to preserve. The collecting process amplified existing patterns of textual survival rather than redistributing them neutrally. This means that the textual tradition the modern world inherits from Mesopotamian cuneiform literature is not a random cross-section of what was written. It is the output of a series of institutional selection processes, curriculum choices in scribal schools, acquisition choices by royal library collectors, preservation choices by temple librarians that favoured certain texts over others, and within texts favoured certain editorial versions over others. The Gilgamesh Standard Version Sneltsi Unini's revised edition, with its weakened Anunnaki descriptions, was the version that entered the canonical curriculum and the royal library collections. The Atrahasis survived more narrowly. The gap between the two texts, in terms of their institutional prestige, is part of the explanation for why the revised version of the Anunnaki flood account became the default and the older version had to be recovered by modern scholarship. Nick Veldwis, whose work on Babylonian scribal education and the structure of the Nippur curriculum is the most systematic modern treatment of the subject, documented in his 2004 study, Religion, Literature and Scholarship, the Sumerian Composition Name and the Birds, How Curriculum Choices reflected theological and ideological priorities of the scribal institutions making them. Schools did not simply copy whatever was available. They selected, standardized, and maintained specific versions of specific texts for reasons that were not always transparent, but were never neutral. A text that presented the Anunnaki as vulnerable, hungry, and physically dependent on human offerings was a text that a theologically conservative scribal curriculum had reasons to de-emphasize relative to a text that presented them as elevated, fearful, and cosmically sovereign. The curriculum is itself a form of editorial revision. It does not change the words in a tablet. It changes which tablets get copied. The geographical problem, what Nippur knew that Babylon didn't the Anunnaki textual tradition, did not develop in a single city. It developed across multiple cities, Nippur, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and later Babylon, Assur and Nineveh each, with its own temple archives, scribal schools, and local theological emphases. What any given text says about the Anunnaki depends significantly on where that text was produced, because the Anunnaki were not a pan-Mesopotamian abstraction. They were, in the oldest stratum of the tradition, local powers associated with specific cities and specific divine genealogies that differed between traditions. Nippur's Anunnaki tradition was organised around Enlil. As the city of Enlil's primary temple, the Eka, the mountain house, which was the most politically significant temple in the Sumerian world, for most of the 3rd millennium BC, Nippur's literary tradition placed Enlil and the divine assembly he presided over at the centre of theological authority. The Anunnaki in Nippur texts are primarily the assembly that gathers in Enlil's court to decree fate. Their earth presence is mediated through his governance. Their departure from a city is authorized by his decree. The city lament tradition, which centers on divine assembly decisions to abandon cities, is a Nippur-inflected theological framework. It imagines divine governance through the model of Enlil's court. Eridu's Anunnaki tradition was organized around Enki. Eridu was the southernmost of the great Sumerian cities, located at the edge of the freshwater marshes where the Euphrates Delta met the sea, and its theological tradition associated Enki with the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean, as his residence and domain. The Enki tradition presented a differently textured understanding of divine earth presence. Enki was immanent in water, in wisdom, in craft, in the capacity to solve problems that Enlil's decrees created. The Atrahasis epic in which it is Enki who warns the flood hero and provides the technical knowledge to build the boat, is an Eridu-inflected text. It imagines divine engagement with humanity through Enki's practical interventionist model rather than Enlil's judicial decree issuing one. The tension between these two theological traditions, Enlil's assembly and Enki's intervention, is not merely a difference of theological style. It represents two different understandings of what divine presence on earth consisted of and what divine withdrawal from earth would mean. In Enlil's model, divine presence is governmental. The gods decree, the world obeys. And withdrawal is the revocation of governance. In Enki's model, divine presence is relational. The gods engage practically with specific situations, and withdrawal is the ending of an active, responsive relationship. When the Babylonian theological tradition, centered on Marduk and his city of Babylon, synthesized these older traditions in the Enma Eli, it did so by making Marduk the inheritor of both Enlil's governance authority and Enki's practical wisdom. The epic explicitly transfers both divine roles to Marduk as part of his elevation to supreme deity. The Anunnaki in this synthesis are neither the assembly of Enlil's court nor the practical companions of Enki's interventions. They are Marduk's organizational staff, assigned to positions within a cosmological structure that Marduk designed. Both older traditions are absorbed, but in being absorbed, they are also neutralized. The Enlil tradition's departure-capable assembly and the Enki tradition's practically engaged earth-present wisdom are both replaced by a static administrative arrangement that neither tradition would have recognized as its own. The geographical dispersal of the Anunnaki tradition means that what the popular understanding calls the Sumerian texts is actually a composite of at least two distinct theological traditions, with different home cities, different primary deities, and different models of divine-human relationship. When those traditions are collapsed into a single Sumerian account of the Anunnaki, the tensions between them disappear, and the tensions are precisely where the most interesting evidence lives. The word that survived its own meaning, Namtaru there, is a single word in the cuneiform lexical tradition that carries the weight of the Anunnaki's theological migration more precisely than any other, and it has received almost no attention in the popular literature on the subject. The word is Namtaru, or in its full form, Namtar, which appears in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts in two distinct grammatical and theological capacities that the tradition itself seems at times to have conflated deliberately. In its first capacity, Namtaru is a common noun meaning fate, destiny, or the divine decree that assigns a being its portion in existence. It is etymologically related to the verb taru, meaning to turn or to return, and carries connotations of cyclicality. The fate that is assigned is also the fate that returns. The portion that is given is also the portion that must be given back. When the Anunnaki decree fate in the Ur-3, text the active, earth-present function that defined their theological role in the oldest stratum of the tradition, the act they are performing, is Namtaru, the assignment of existential portions to humans, cities, kings, and seasons. In its second capacity, Namtar is a specific divine figure, a deity, or perhaps better described as a divine functionary who serves as the Sukkol, the minister or herald of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. In Inanna's descent, it is Namtar who carries out Ereshkigal's commands, who fetches the Anunnaki from their hall, who strikes the goddess Inanna with 60 diseases after she is condemned by the divine judges. In the Akkadian version of the same composition, Numtar is described as Ereshkigal's son, born of her union with the storm god. The same word fate, the divine assignment of existential portions, is also the name of the underworld's chief functionary. This is not coincidence. It is a theological compression that tells a story the explicit texts do not narrate. If Fate Namtaru is what the Anunnaki perform in the oldest texts, and Namtar is the name of the underworld's operating agent in the later texts, then the words two lives track the Anunnaki's theological migration precisely. The function that was once the Anunnaki's primary earth, present activity, the decree of fate, has been personified, assigned a body, given a home address in the underworld, and placed in subordination to the underworld queen. The abstract authority of the Anunnaki's fate-decreeing function has become a specific figure who executes that function on behalf of the underworld hierarchy. This is what the Enma Eli does cosmologically reassign the Anunnaki's functions to a Babylonian administrative structure, but the word Namtaru does it lexically, inside the language itself. The linguistic record preserved what the theological revision was processing. The fate that the Anunnaki decreed from their earth, present positions in the Ur-3 texts, became, in the underworld theology of the later period, a named agent working in the underworld bureaucracy. The word survived. Its subject changed address. Ben Auster, in his work on Sumerian proverbs and lexical traditions, documented the range of Namtaru usages across the cuneiform corpus, and the semantic range he maps suggests that the word's dual existence as common noun and as divine name was understood by Mesopotamian scribes as something more than homonymy. The fate-decreeing Anunnaki and the underworld agent Namtar were connected in the tradition's own understanding, connected in a way that the tradition's explicit texts never spelled out, but that the word's own history implies. The scribes who used Namtaru in both capacities inhabited a tradition that knew the connection even when it did not state it. The return that never came, reading the laments against their endings, the city lament compositions, were not elegies in the modern sense, not purely retrospective expressions of grief for something permanently lost. They were, as noted earlier, liturgical instruments designed to facilitate divine return. The lament tradition assumed that the gods had left, and equally assumed that they could be persuaded to come back. The textual pattern of the lament compositions reflects this double orientation. The poems describe departure in elaborate, grieving detail, and they end with prayers of petition that address the departed deity directly, asking, sometimes demanding, that the god restore the city, return to the temple, resume the governance that the departure had suspended. What makes the city lament endings theologically significant in the context of this investigation is what they do not say. The lament for Ur ends with a prayer to Nana, the moon god, patron of Ur, requesting his return to his city and his temples. The prayer is conditional in its formulation if Nana will return, if Enlil will release Ur from its decreed fate, if the divine assembly will reconsider, then the city can be restored. The conditionality is not rhetorical hedging. It reflects the lament tradition's honest acknowledgement that divine return was not guaranteed. The gods might not come back. The fate decreed for the city might be permanent. The lament for Nippur contains a formulation that is even more explicit about this uncertainty. In the petition section, the text addresses Enlil directly, asking him to remember his city, the use of the word remember being theologically precise. implying that the god's departure has created something like divine forgetting, a withdrawal of divine attention that needs to be actively reversed. But the petition is framed as a hope rather than an expectation. The lament priest who performed this text was not announcing that Enlil would return. He was asking that he might. This conditionality, the possibility that the Anunnaki's departure from the cities might be permanent, is the aspect of the city lament tradition that no subsequent theological framework fully absorbed. The Enma Eli resolved the problem by denying that departure had occurred in any meaningful sense. The Anunnaki were in their assigned stations, and what the city laments described as departure was, within the Babylonian administrative cosmology, simply a temporary fluctuation in divine attention, not a genuine ontological removal. The poem of Error acknowledged the departure, but framed it as Marduk's singular decision, reversible once the conditions that prompted it were addressed. Neither text entertained the lament tradition's most unsettling implication, that the gods might have left, and that leaving might be something gods do without a guaranteed return schedule. The Sumerian theological tradition in the city lament corpus preserved a conception of divine withdrawal that was genuinely open-ended. The Anunnaki's departure from specific cities was a real event with real consequences, and the tradition's mechanism for addressing it liturgical performance, priestly petition. Ritual technology was the best tool available, but it was a tool, not a guarantee. The gods were asked to return. They were not compelled to. This open-endedness was what the later Babylonian theological synthesis could not accommodate. A cosmological system organised around divine administrative stability, Marduk's assigned stations. The Anunnaki in their fixed positions had no structural place for the possibility that gods might leave permanently, or that the liturgical tradition's best efforts might prove insufficient. The lament tradition's honest uncertainty was replaced by a cosmological certainty that, in making the Anunnaki's positions permanent and assigned, made their departure conceptually impossible. The texts that preserved the uncertainty the city laments themselves survived, but the theological framework that made the uncertainty thinkable was replaced, and without that framework, the lament endings read as confident prayers rather than uncertain petitions, as liturgical formulas rather than genuine negotiations with an open outcome. The words survived. The weight of the conditionality they once carried was transferred to a theological framework that no longer existed to receive it. What the silence of Enki means one final observation belongs in this record, and it concerns not what the texts say, but what a specific figure fails to say across the entire span of evidence the investigation has examined. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki is the god who warns the flood hero. He is the one who finds a way around Enlil's decree, speaking not directly to the human, the text carefully notes, but to the wall of a reed house, so that the human overhears rather than receives the divine communication directly. Enki's intervention is characterized by indirection, by the creative navigation of constraints that other gods accept as absolute. He is the Anunnaki's dissenter. When Enlil decrees that humanity must be destroyed, Enki does not agree and does not comply. He finds another way. After the flood, in the Atrahasis, Enki proposes the compromise human mortality, infertility, infant death that resolves the divine assembly's problem with human population growth. He is the pragmatist, the problem solver, the one whose engagement with the human situation is substantive rather than merely judicial. In the Gilgamesh Standard Version, Enki's equivalent E. His Akkadian name performs the same functions, but in a different register. The warning is preserved, the compromise is preserved. But the specific texture of Enki's earth engagement, his practical creativity, his willingness to work against Enlil's decrees through indirection is somewhat smoothed. E in the Gilgamesh tradition is divine wisdom, Enki in the Atrahasis is divine cleverness. The distinction is subtle but real. Wisdom is a property, cleverness is a relationship. Enki's cleverness is relational because it is always directed towards something toward the human situation, toward the specific problem at hand. In the city lament corpus, Enki is one of the deities who abandons his temple. He leaves Eridu. The wild bull of Eridug has let the breezes haunt his sheepfold. The figure who was most actively engaged with the human situation, the god who warned the flood hero, who proposed the compromise, who found the workaround, is included in the list of departures without distinction. He leaves like the others. The text does not record any additional attempt on his part to find another way. This silence is the lament tradition's most honest admission. Even the Anunnaki's most earth-engaged member, the one whose entire theological character was defined by his refusal to accept catastrophe as inevitable, departs with the others when the divine assembly decrees it. The cleverness that found a path through the flood finds no equivalent path through the withdrawal. The departure is total. Whether this reflects the lament tradition's understanding that the Anunnaki's departure was genuinely comprehensive, that no individual divine descent was possible within the structure of the assembly's decree, or whether it reflects something else, something harder to name, the scribe's own intuition that the withdrawal was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be mourned, is a question the lament texts carry without answering. Enki's silence in the departure passages is the investigation's final, most compact image. The god who always found another way did not find one this time. The sheepfold stood open. The breezes moved through unoccupied rooms. The clay that recorded it was fired and buried and recovered and read by people in a world the scribe could not have imagined people still asking 4,000 years later what the departure meant and whether anything like a return was ever promised. The texts do not promise it. They ask for it. There is a distance between those two things. And it is the distance the city lament tradition lived inside and preserved and handed forward in the only medium that could carry it this far. Fired clay. The weight of it, still,